women workers. And I really encourage folks to take a look at the materials on the EPI website, which is epi.org, to dig in and learn more about these incredibly important issues. So I'm going to say just a couple of things by way of introduction, and then we'll launch right into it with our speakers. And but before I start, I really want to thank Emily and Bernadette for helping put this session together and helping your moderator, who is not the most technologically adept human on the earth. Yes, this is a BlackBerry. I still use it. They have set me up to hopefully successfully moderate this session, but if it doesn't go all that well, that's not on Emily and Bernadette, that's on me. And I apologize in advance. So this session is focused on dealing with the COVID-19 virus in the workplace, some of the challenges and issues it presents. And we are really fortunate to have with us to speak on this panel 3 practitioners who have been spending the last 6-7 weeks advising their union and advising their employer clients on how to deal with myriad aspects of this disease. They are working with employers who are trying to keep plants open. They are working with employers who have closed and are trying to reopen. They are working with employers who've been open all along and have public-facing workers, such as grocery workers. And they are going to share with us this morning some of the issues that they're facing as they work through this pandemic with their clients. And we're just so fortunate that they have been able to take time out of the midst of their crazy schedules and lives to share their expertise with us today. So I really want to, at the outset, thank them, and I will at the end as well, but really appreciate your time. And just a quick word about what we're going to cover and what we're not going to cover. So this is COVID-19 in the workplace, a very practical, on-the-ground session about some of the issues that our speakers are facing. Even though this is a seminar sponsored by the Labor and Employment Law practice group, this is not going to be a legal session where we get deep into the ins and outs of the law, but more it's how our practitioners dealing with these issues as they come up in the workplace. So very practical, very on the ground. We are also not going to be digging in on healthcare, and we're not going to be digging in on construction. Those are both topics of future webinars that LERA is offering, and we encourage everybody to sign up for those. And lastly, we're going to be very focused on the private sector. Our speakers are not dealing primarily in the public sector. So we're going to be private sector, nuts and bolts, on the ground, how's it going in the workplace. And I share the sentiment of all of you that I'm really looking forward to hearing what our speakers have to say. So I'm going to introduce them. They're each going to take a few minutes to offer some opening comments. And then we're going to turn it over. I'm going to offer each of them a chance to respond to each other, and then we're going to turn it over to your comments and questions. You can do that in 2 ways. You can use the chat function, which is, you know, everybody's familiar with how Zoom works now, right? 6 weeks ago, maybe we weren't. Now we all know Zoom. And I don't know about anybody else. I have a love-hate relationship, and but there's the chat function at the bottom, and if you want to write a question, I'll see it, and we can try to, I can ask the questions of the speakers and try to combine questions together. Or if you want to raise your hand, there's a way to do that through the participant tab, and hopefully we'll see that your name is highlighted and call on you. If we do that, I will ask that you keep your comment or your question relatively brief so that we can get to a lot of comments and questions in this session. And I also am going to claim the right to claim moderator's prerogative and barge in with my own questions along the way, because full disclosure, I have several, and if you don't ask them, I just might. So now I am going to try very hard to share a screen and show you a slide. Let's see. Did it work? Can you see the slide?
Yep, it worked.
Oh, okay, I'm so pleased. So our speakers this morning are first Carla Siegel, Carla is the Deputy General Counsel of the International Association of Machinists, which is an international labor union based here in the Washington, D.C. area. The Machinists have about 600,000 active and retired members in the US and Canada. who work in manufacturing, in airlines, in transportation, and other industries. And since the beginning of the COVID crisis, Carla has been immersed in the many ways COVID-19 is impacting Machinists members and employers. So we're very fortunate that Carla is able to join us today. Thank you, Carla. After Carla, we're going to hear from Ken Dolin, and we even get to see Ken Dolin because he got his video working, so we're very excited about that. Ken is a partner in the Chicago office of Seyfarth Shaw, where he represents employers, both unionized employers and non-union employers, primarily in the manufacturing sector. And he represents employers in a wide range of labor and employment matters. Because his focus is on manufacturing, he is dealing with some of the same issues and employers as Carla, so that should be an interesting overlap. So thank you, Ken, for being here. Then after Ken, we're going to hear from Ken's colleague, Brad Livingston. Brad is also a partner at Seyfarth Shaw in Chicago, and he also represents employers in labor and employment matters. But his practice differs from Ken's in that among the clients Brad represents are retail employers, grocery employers, and the like. And so Brad is going to talk to us about some of the unique issues and challenges facing employers whose workers are interacting with the public, and the particular health and safety and other concerns that that relationship poses. And if you all don't ask enough questions and make enough comments, I just noticed reading his bio that Brad is from my home state of Michigan. We're fellow Michiganders. And if you don't ask questions, we're going to do that annoying where you're from Michigan hand thing to just fill up the time. So fair warning to you. So we're going to go Carla, Ken, Brad, give the speakers a chance to respond to each other, and then turn to your questions. And with no more from me by way of introduction, and with thanks to our speakers, Carla, the virtual floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to LERA for inviting me to participate in this program. And I'm honored to share this program with two other great labor lawyers that are out there on the management side. So let me get straight to talking about what some of the unions are doing in this context. You know, unions, various employers have different relationships with their unions, but I will say in this context where we have this type of universal emergency going on, we're seeing that unions are playing a renewed role in a lot of places where we need to get creative to work with employers on saving jobs, on saving companies, and therefore also helping the economy. As everybody knows, there's a lot of stress right there, not just on the companies, but also on the economy. And the key to all of that is making sure that people are still working. So, for example, by way of example, we have a number of workforces where the number of employees that are necessary have dwindled, but the union has been able to renegotiate with the employer that some people who perhaps earlier had been doing highly skilled jobs are now taking on additional responsibilities, such as responsibilities for cleaning various portions of the workplace, or even after the appropriate training, temperature taking, or various things like that. So there's additional responsibilities that we see in the workplace that are caused by COVID. And with the proper negotiations, you of course have to make sure you're consistent with your scope agreements in your contract. We can get creative about how to get the things done that need to be done in the workplace to protect everybody, and keep people employed and the economy flowing. At the same time, it's also really important to be sure that, I'm sorry, I'm suddenly getting feedback. Are you getting feedback? Okay. It's really important to be sure that people who are ill or may have been exposed to people who are ill are not at work, because the CDC has made it very clear that that is necessary to protect everybody in the community. So another thing that the unions are busily doing is negotiating with employers about what to do with those people who either are sick with signs of COVID, have been diagnosed with COVID, or who have actually been exposed to somebody even though they don't have any symptoms yet. Everybody, I assume, is aware that the federal government has provided for paid sick leave or paid FMLA for employers with fewer than 500 employees. But that's only a portion, and in our world anyway, it's a small portion of the workforce. There obviously are many, many, many employers who have more than 500 employees. And so the question is, how, for those that are essential employers, how do we stay open? Or even if they're not essential, but you're in one of these states where we're reopening, how do you reopen and make sure that people are not coming to work who are impacted, who may spread this disease? But you know, as many of you know, the many workers are not able to take 2 weeks off while they're self-quarantined without pay. And so they just won't do it. And so how can we keep these people home and away from other workers, which keeps everybody safe, and continue to pay them? Well, the CDC has actually issued guidance that employers, even if you have more than 500 employees, should be providing paid leave. And that's one of the things that we are negotiating at our workplaces, is paid leave for people who actually are sick with symptoms of COVID-19, paid leave for people who are home treating ill family members due to COVID-19, paying people who have been exposed and are self-quarantined for 14 days to keep them away from the workforce and keep everyone safe. In addition, we're looking at paying people who have been ordered to shelter in place who are not essential employees, or people who have to stay home to care for children because schools are closed or childcare is closed. And you know, we don't have time to really get into it today, but Lynn mentioned at the outset, and I will reiterate, we have to be really careful about how this is impacting women traditionally and who are traditional childcare or family care people. And you know, if the people who are staying home caring for the children are getting 2/3 pay, how does that impact? And is there, you know, we have to take a look at how this is affecting people, women and minorities in particular. In addition to that, the unions are negotiating to protect jobs when people return from sick leave. So some people may be out with COVID for long periods of time. Unfortunately, some of the people who are hospitalized for weeks. And we need to make sure that once they are healthy and able to return to the workforce, that they have a job to return to. In addition, it's really important, and we're bargaining to ensure that for those workforces that have what's often called a no-fault attendance program, where you get points for being out of work, that being out for this COVID-related conditions, whether you're caring for somebody or self-quarantining or actually ill, doesn't count against a no-fault attendance or a point-based program. Just like the FMLA can't count against a no-fault or attendance-based program, we are also bargaining that the COVID-19 doesn't count against that, again, to encourage people to stay out of the workplace if they've actually been exposed or they're dealing with it. Another thing the CDC has recommended is that employers don't require doctor notes upon return. And the reason for that is that doctors are swamped dealing with COVID-19, and the CDC doesn't want to have to further burden them by providing these doctor notes. So they have guidance as to when you can safely return to work. Essentially, it's 2 negative tests for COVID-19 if you've already been exposed. I believe it's within a 3-day period, but you can check on the CDC's guidelines to confirm that. I know I'm running out of time, so I quickly say we're also negotiating for basically a hazardous duty pay. Some places are calling it a thank you pay for essential workers who have to continue to work and are taking a risk just by leaving their home every day and coming into work and doing the jobs that we all need done. So some places are negotiating that, and that comes in many different forms. And we're also bargaining about making sure that employers provide notice to the workforce when somebody has been exposed. And that's really important. And you have to be careful about doing that consistent with the ADA. but it's also required by OSHA to provide notice to workers when they've been exposed to unsafe conditions. And then finally, the other thing that I want to touch on, because I just know I only have a few minutes and Lynn's going to need to cut me off, but we're also trying to bargain with employers that before they go to the point of actually laying people off, that to make sure that they've considered the numerous federal programs that are out there to help businesses. For example, to help small businesses with the Paycheck Protection program that's out there, which essentially can provide relief to small businesses to continue employees on the payroll for the first 8 weeks. So that can help extend before considering layoffs. Larger businesses are also able to get loans at pretty discounted rates. There's also the Paycheck Tax Relief Program, which provides tax credit to organizations under circumstances where they're fully or partially suspended due to COVID-19, or where their gross receipts have declined by more than 50% compared over the year. And the last thing that we're trying to bargain for before employers think about layoffs is to do either furloughs. And what I mean by that is where maybe people don't work for 1 week, and so they're not getting paid for that week, but they continue to have an employment relationship with the company, so they're continuing to get health care. Or where there's some form of a work share program where maybe employees split a week, and one employee works 3 days this week and they don't work 2 days, and then in the opposite week, the other employee who worked only 2 days the first week works 3 days the next week, something like that. Those employees may still be eligible for some federal pandemic unemployment relief, and it cuts your payroll, what you have to do, but it keeps people working. So in the unionized workforce, we have been really trying to be as creative as possible to save jobs and to keep people employed, which also saves the companies and by extension, the economy, while still protecting everyone. Lynn, I hope I didn't go too far over my time. I'll talk about health and safety stuff a little bit later.
That's great. Thank you, Carla. There's a lot there and a lot to dig into. So thank you. Ken, we're going to turn it over to you. You need to unmute, Ken. Please unmute. Beautiful. Thank you. Now? Yep. Great. Thanks.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you for your help in putting this together. It was a lot of work. Carla, thank you for your comments. I'll try not to be repetitive, but perhaps there will be some overlap. Let me just say, as general principles, most of my clients take the position that they want to keep the business running and keep the workplace as safe as they possibly can. So for that reason, my experience is this is an area where the unions and management seem to have much more in common than many other areas where you're fighting over a given piece of the pie. I have found most unions that I have dealt with to be very constructive in this process. And there have been a lot of issues that we have come across. To echo in part what Carla was saying, we deal with business restructurings, from actual permanent closings of facilities to layoffs of permanent or indefinite duration. And we have certainly gotten the unions involved in discussing about that. I would say that's the most severe measure. Fortunately, it is not the most common. Secondly, we deal with job restructurings, and job restructurings could take the form of changing their hours, splitting jobs, as Carla referred to, reducing hours generally, changing hours, changing vacation pay. Most of my clients are receptive to basically being more lenient on attendance policies and points per the CDC guidelines. And we haven't found it to be an issue. I think everybody is aligned. We don't want people who have tested positive for COVID-19 to be in the workplace. Changing a pay is an issue where we have dealt with that actually in two different contexts. One context is where unions have requested premium pay, thank you pay, hazard pay, however you want to phrase it. Most of my clients have not been candidly very receptive, and most of the unions haven't pushed that to the brink. But that does come up, in virtually every union that we have dealt with has requested that. We also deal with it on the other side, not in the unionized context, and that is reduced pay for salary people. Many times that's accompanied by reduced hours, and there are wage hour law implications about changing hours, changing pay, but that actually has been an area where, frankly, my clients have made more changes than in the bargaining units that they deal with. I'd say probably the biggest issue that we deal with regard to unions is in working conditions. And it runs the gamut. And again, I have found the unions to generally be very constructive in this. They too want a safe workplace. It takes the form of taking temperatures, which is what has been recommended, PPE type issues, whether it be gloves, whether it be masks, which is somewhat controversial. Not only has the CDC changed its mind with regard to masks, but we have found that many of the employees just do not want to wear masks, even where employees probably should wear masks, particularly given the CDC guidelines about not spreading it where the employees are working in close proximity. Hand sanitizers, deep cleans where there have, of the facility where there have been COVID-19 positive cases, maintaining social distancing, which is very difficult, particularly in the communal rooms, break rooms, lunch rooms and the like, bathrooms and the like, questionnaires. Sometimes we run into situations where the unions have requested the names of particular employees who have tested positive, and we try to work with the union around those issues. We understand why they would ask, and I think most unions understand why we are reluctant to disclose that information, but still get to the heart of it in what's called accommodative bargaining and try to figure out what they're really seeking. And that has actually taken place in a number of situations that I've been involved in. The last major area that I have been involved in is work stoppages, and frankly, my experience with work stoppages regarding COVID-19 has been in the unrepresented workforce, not with the union represented workforce. I've had a couple of situations where the unrepresented employees, perhaps with urgings behind the scenes with unions, we're not quite sure, but they have walked off because of unsafe conditions is what they've claimed. Frankly, our position was let's make the workplace as safe as we can. We did, after one employee group walked off, we did a deep clean. We provided hand sanitizers, gloves, masks and the like, and the employees went back to work. We also instituted their temperature taking using a qualified third-party contractor to assist. We've also looked at ways where we could have more spacing with regard to the operational flow. That's probably difficult in some areas, but where we can make changes, we have. And so I think that's the overview of the types of issues I've dealt with. I would just tell you that the approach of management, you know, it's the proverbial multi-legged stool where you want to keep the operation running. You want to make sure the workplace is safe. You want to certainly make sure that you follow the collective bargaining agreement and federal and local state laws. And finally, you do want to consider CDC guidelines, and I certainly recommend to clients that they look at it, and if there are reasons why they can't follow in a particular case, fine. But that should be the presumptive norm because that's what the government is expecting, and frankly, it's consistent with the idea of maintaining a safe workplace. That's it. I hope I have left some time for my colleague Brad Livingston to fill in all the areas that he has dealt in. And again, Lynn, thank you so much for all that you've done in this.
Great. Thank you so much, Ken. That was very interesting. And I have about 17 follow-up questions so far for both of you. But first, we will turn to my fellow Michigander, Brad, to get your comments, particularly as they relate to public-facing workplaces.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I think you might be muted. Brad, can you start over? I think you're muted. That didn't look good. There you are. Okay. Try again, Brad.
Right.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Retail grocery, we thought it would be interesting to talk about that as a separate industry because it is likely unique in this area of coronavirus. There is, with restaurants being closed, typically curbside takeout, people are cooking at home and there's far more demand. Food is clearly essential to everyone. And as a result of that, people want to shop and they want food. People are baking more, people are eating more at home. And so the demand at the retail grocery level is incredibly high. So unlike other industries that are talking about furloughs and layoffs, retail grocery needs more employees to go ahead and fill the void. And probably the most important issue for any retailer has to do with health and safety. And employee health and safety is a significant issue. And it's kind of interesting because I will give the UFCW credit because the United Food and Commercial Workers have done a phenomenal job of pushing the envelope of employee safety. And whether it's the union, whether it's different local governments, because we don't see a lot of guidance from the federal government, but whether it's local government pushing for, whether you want to call it hazard pay, hero pay, whatever you want to call it, treating them as essential workers, giving them special treatment. There's a lot of pressure to go ahead and protect grocery workers. When you think about it, a lot of hospitals haven't been able to do elective surgeries. And so their admissions may be down across big parts of the country. Retail grocery faces the opposite example where more and more people want to shop. So when it comes to health and safety, virtually every retailer, union, non-union, is looking at increased communication with their employees, training, best practices, telling people if they don't feel well, don't come in, talking about different ways of social distancing. So a lot of different things going on there. There is typically a daily check at the start of employee shift, whether it's with those infrared thermometers, a checklist going through the different indicators for coronavirus, asking employees when they come to work to make sure that they're safe and don't have any of the symptoms of coronavirus. Personal protective equipment, whether voluntary or more likely in a lot of the retail grocery context, mandatory masks for employees, providing gloves, providing sanitizers, individually or collectively for employees to use. Any of you who've been to the grocery store lately see the push for plexiglass at check lanes, so that customers and employees have some degree of separation. Markings in the floors of the check lanes, keeping carts at least 6 feet apart from each other as they go ahead and go through, and using alternating check lanes, all with the goal of trying to provide some sort of social distancing. But in addition to that, retail grocers are having to shift, in many respects, the way that they operate. And so hours of operation are often a little bit different, not just providing different hours for seniors or healthcare and health and safety type workers, police, fire and others, but closing down early, perhaps to do deep sanitation on a daily basis. Different hours to go ahead and stock shelves when customers aren't there. There's a lot of different efforts being taken to go ahead and provide safe ways of working. And then when it comes to the customer experience, obviously there are just differences as well, where many stores are limiting the number of customers that can be in the store at any one time. Typical rules range from 5 per 1,000 square feet of floor space. There's some international guidelines that would increase that to roughly 8, but limits on customers. And that leads some grocers to be hiring different types of people than they had before. For example, a greeter who may stand at the door and physically limit the number of people in the store at any one time. That person with a mask and sanitizing wipes, perhaps wiping down a cart before individual customers go ahead and enter the store so that they can be safe working there. Signage in the stores for customers. Again, encouraging one way through the aisles with arrows in the floor, trying to keep people moving in a consistent direction so that they're not passing each other as things go on. Although I'll tell you, in my anecdotal experience, that's honored more in the breach than in reality. People don't seem to understand which way arrows work when they're in a retail grocery store. Again, it leads to a whole different issue, as most retailers, if you go to a grocery store, I'm going to guess that you're likely to see a sign that they're hiring, because retail groceries in particular have looked to expand their workforces significantly. Not just greeters, but people to perform stocking functions so that existing employees can spend more time at registers and performing other functions. But that leads to a number of different issues. First of all, in unionized facilities, they may be viewed as temporary, maybe looking for different terms and conditions of employment. When it comes to Taft-Hartley plans, defined benefit plans, and Taft-Hartley health and welfare programs, typically the funds require participation. For employers, that's a cost issue. They have to factor that overall into what they do. Many Taft-Hartley funds require contributions after somebody leaves, and for temporary jobs, you would need the funds to agree if there's going to be any relief. It becomes a difficult issue in negotiations. So whether it's sanitation, greeters, different hiring procedures, just to try to get people on board quickly, because the need is so quick. But all that leads to what terms and conditions of employment apply. And as Carla and Ken said, there are a lot of them that are being negotiated for resulting in different MOUs at unionized facilities, but even non-union employers are doing a lot of the same things to try to provide for enough people to work. So those changes in store hours to provide deep sanitation, to allow stocking of shelves when customers aren't around, flexible scheduling of employees, again, for people who have childcare needs. And historically, at least, retail grocery has had primarily female cashiers who may have greater childcare needs than the average employer, trying to figure out a way to make that work. In some jurisdictions, there are predictive scheduling laws that require a schedule 2 weeks in advance. For retail grocery, given the uncertain situation, that becomes more difficult. And then ultimately, when it comes to wages, negotiations that I've seen typically result in either a 10% premium or a $2 per hour premium. And most employers, are union and non-union, are looking to go ahead and provide something to employees to make that work. And ultimately, as Carla indicated, like the IAM has been negotiating, the push for paid leave for people who have coronavirus type issues. That is a significant issue. Those people are on the front lines. They are dealing with the public on a daily basis. So most employers realize they need to do something. And again, when it comes to attendance programs, when it comes to different policies, most employers don't want to lose a good employee during this period of time. It's a lot tougher to hire someone than it is to keep a decent employee. And so most of my retail employers are working hard to accommodate and keep the people that they have, whether in a union or a non-union environment. And so for that, I'll stop for the moment.
Great, thank you, Brad. And I really appreciate your comments about the United Food and Commercial Workers Union and all that they are doing to bring the health and safety issues to the fore. It's so true and so important. I'm going to turn it back to Carla for just a couple of minutes to add on to the health and safety points, and then we're going to go to your questions and comments. And we already have a few in the chat, which I'll ask that are very interesting questions, and go ahead and chat questions if you'd like. But Carla, do you want to add on just a couple of minutes on the health and safety issues?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Brad. I think that was a comprehensive discussion about some of the health and safety issues, particularly in the supermarket arena. And as a customer of the supermarkets, I certainly appreciate that. A few extra points about what's happening in some of the manufacturing or some of the other areas that is not like a supermarket. And I will say, I have to echo what my colleagues on the panel have said. That I think unions and companies, for the most part, have really been working quite creatively in trying to do all of this, in part because we haven't really gotten the type of guidance from OSHA that we might have expected. And so there was sort of a breakdown and a lag in the federal guidance of what should happen in the workplace. And there's been some inconsistencies. So that has left it to the unions and the employers to really try to scramble and come up with a lot of these things. Some additional things to think about in different types of workplaces might be whether you provide in your restrooms, whether you have those dispensers where it's hand touch free. So you just wave your hand under the water, the soap, the towel, to get materials to limit the surfaces that people are touching. Providing more hand washing breaks that are available. Making sure that when people, if you have a workforce that is that clocks in and clocks out every day, how do they do that? For places that had adopted biometric scanners and things like that, you really want to make sure that maybe we stay away from those so that we don't have people touching the same surface, or you're providing wipes to make sure that the surfaces are cleaned in and out. It's going to take longer, especially if we're doing temperature screenings, for people to come in the workplaces. And so we have to think about paid time for that type of thing. In a shop where people are using tools, we want to make sure people are using their own tools or they're thoroughly cleaned in between shifts. I think Ken talked about staggering shifts or changing hours to have fewer people in the workplace at a particular time. And we think about that in as well for meetings. If you have, for example, morning briefings or briefings throughout the day, and you would normally have 20 or 30 people at those briefings, you might want to break those up into 3 separate briefings so that you only have 10 people in the meetings and you have less people congregated together. In the break rooms, we want to change the seating in the break rooms to make sure that people are sufficiently spaced apart. And, you know, like I said, where there haven't been the gear provided by the government that's been necessary, I know the unions have been stepping in, and we've been providing, for example, masks, cloth masks to people in the airlines to make sure that they have the sufficient masks that are necessary there, because it's hard for some employers to be able to buy them even from places because they're just not being produced the way that they should be. So with that, I know we want to leave time for questions, so I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Carla. All of the panelists' comments make very clear that the workplace is not going to be the same ever as we ever, experienced it before COVID in so many ways. It's really something. So folks, go ahead and chat a question or raise your hands, and I'll try to figure out how to do that with Emily and Bernadette's help. But we have a few in the queue that I will start with. The first question came in regarding the availability of paid sick leave with a question: to the extent employers are requiring proof that somebody has COVID or has been exposed to COVID, and there's not testing really available now, and as Carla pointed out, it's hard to get into the doctor's office, how is a person who can't get access to testing supposed to access paid leave? Thoughts from any of the panelists?
Well, my initial thoughts are, that there has been a relaxation of under the Americans with Disabilities Act of what employers can ask employees. So you can certainly ask an employee, well, what were your symptoms, or when were you exposed, or why do you think you were exposed, to test that a little further. But it is incongruent to require testing or a doctor's note when people may not be able to get a test because they're not available or doctors are too swamped to provide notes. So I think you can just ask a few more questions just to make sure it's consistent. But to require that type of testing might be impossible for the individual to do.
Echoing what Carla said, I agree, flexibility, and I think it is a situation where it depends on the circumstances of the particular case, where the facility is located. If doctors are available, I know that doctors are doing more telephonically, where they will ask about symptoms and then give some kind of note. I know that companies are also asking more questions along the lines of what Carla was suggesting. My clients have taken a flexible approach, and I think the default is to defer to the employee, but not absolutely.
Great. Here is a question for Brad. Have any grocery retailers made a shift to curbside pickup? What is the feasibility and the potential effects of that on health and safety as well as operations? Curbside pickups at groceries.
Actually, it's relatively common, whether it's Instacart or different retail grocers offering their own delivery services, or even curbside pickup. Retail grocers are in fact doing it to a greater or lesser extent. Again, it depends upon who's available, because there's labor involved in going through the aisles, making selections. To the extent that a product is out of stock, and we've seen a lot of that. That whether it was toilet paper before or meat products now, and you've all seen with what's going on in the meat packing plants, what's going on with pork and beef, and what we've seen with chicken in the past, looking for substitute products. It'll be a function of the availability of staff to do it at the retail grocer, figuring out what the ultimate cost of that is, if there is an increased cost. But it is going on, and it's not uncommon in the grocery industry.
Thank you. Here is one, I think, for Ken and Carla, who are most involved in the bargaining table, although Brad, you are too. We have a question, a comment from a questioner saying that an employer has said that COVID, because it's an act of God, trumps seniority provisions in a collective bargaining agreement. Are you seeing that? And do you have thoughts on that?
I've actually never had to take that to the mat. It is an argument that some of the provisions, acts of God and the like, may give the employer more leeway, but practically my position would be, let's try to reach an accommodation and let's try to partner with the union. I've seen that talked about internally with the client, but I've never really done more than maybe reference it to a union. It never has gotten to the point where that was a serious position that the employer drew the line in the sand on, in my experience.
Yeah, I would have to say it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. While COVID might be an excuse for example, having to do layoffs or making the workforce smaller or changing hours, I can't imagine a circumstance where it would allow you to pick and choose among employees and avoid the seniority provisions. The seniority provisions, should still be protecting the employees, even if that means that we have to dwindle the workforce. That's when the seniority provisions kick in. So I can't see how that would apply.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna jump in here with a question. And Ken, you kind of you mentioned this in your comments, but I ask the speakers to elaborate on it a little bit. It seems like there have been almost daily articles in the newspapers about workers at both union and non-union workplaces, but as you pointed out, many non-union workplaces walking out over safety issues at their plants. And Ken, you mentioned that you are seeing this in your practice. I wonder if you want to say a little bit more about that, or Carla or Brad, if you want to say anything more about that. It seems like, workers are feeling like they're not yet safe being at work and are taking it to the streets.
I've seen that. My experience is mixed. I think there's probably some, in some respects, the management at the facilities at issue perhaps could have done a better job as far as sanitizing and keeping the workers safe. I don't want to ignore that. On the other hand, I also think candidly that in some cases this was an issue that maybe unions from the background were whispering in the ears of the employees to try to kind of galvanize the employees to help the unions perhaps organize them in the future. So I've seen some of that too, quite candidly. My recommendations is, we got to make sure that that workplace is safe, union or non-union, union organizing or non-unionizing. We need to do the things, whether it's the deep cleans that in some cases our clients did after the work stoppage started, whether it's providing new rules with regard to social distancing, more places for cleanliness, hand sanitizers, encouraging employees to wash hands. We need to make sure it is our responsibility as management to make sure that we have a safe working conditions, regardless of the motivation for the work stoppages.
Thank you.
I would absolutely agree with that. I'm sorry, Brad, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that I think it's particularly interesting in the retail grocery industry because, in general, everywhere, employees feel stressed and they're worried. And so there will always be something more that any employer can do to provide for safety. No matter how much we ramp it up, other than staying at home and not working, people are always going to be concerned that there's something more that could be done. But in retail grocery, it's particularly stressful because retail grocery workers, they're doing more because sales are frankly going through the roof as people are buying more, may have difficulty getting staff in the stores, and they're dealing with customers. I've seen and talked to retail grocers who, for example, will have a sign outside the store that says, no toilet paper, limit of 2 of any meat product. And nevertheless, customers come and repeatedly ask, do you have any toilet paper? Well, if the customer had seen the sign outside the store, they'd know there is no toilet paper right now. Or they know that 2 of any meat product means you can only grab 2 packages of ground beef. And so that stress from dealing with customers, actually getting close to them, has led to a fair amount of dissatisfaction, stress among workers, which leads perhaps to some unflattering social media posts relating to dealings with customers. Obviously, every retailer wants to be customer friendly and doesn't like those types of posts, but it's a particularly stressful time for the employees. And most of the retailers that I talk with are being very flexible in dealing with employees who deal with that type of stress. I will echo Ken's comments though, in that at least for non-union retailers, they see this as potential of different unions looking to organize workers and get into the workplace. Whether it is that case or not, it's something that employers believe may be occurring.
Can I just jump in and ask a follow-up question to you and I guess to Ken on that? I'm wondering whether you as lawyers who advise management are seeing an uptick in calls from your clients about union organizing questions and activity, given all that's going on.
Lynn, definitely. It really kind of surprises me the extent to which different employers in different industries have expressed a concern that this, particularly with the leading role that a number of different unions within organized labor are playing for employee safety. As employees are concerned, to the extent that unions are viewed as the champion of employee safety, absent anything other than local guidance, it's going on. Ken?
I'm not seeing an uptick, actually. I think maybe the employees are perhaps fearful and the like. I'm actually surprised. I thought there might be more of an uptick than I'm seeing. As I said, I do see these work stoppages, which seem to have some union organizing component to it, at least in some cases. But overall, I would say, well, I think the number of petitions filed at the NLRB have diminished since COVID-19, and that's consistent with my experience as well.
Sorry to jump in with an editorial comment, but the NLRB actually just stopped processing petitions for a while because of COVID. Although they did put out rules to anyhow. I won't go on my rant about that, but I guess it would be. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out going forward, because I think that to me, the benefit of workers having a collective voice on things like their safety and all has just been so clear out there in the public's eye since this crisis started. So it'll be interesting to see how and whether that translates into more organizing. Now I'm really completely violating the moderator's role. So now I'm going back to the questions, and I actually think, looking at the clock, that this may be our last question, because it's a really interesting and complicated question. Can you comment on how you see, basically comment on the tension between tracking workers and their COVID status and the impact that has on their coworkers, and the coworkers wanting to know, the tension between that and worker privacy. And it's going to be something that we're going to be dealing with for the foreseeable future. Each of you has kind of alluded to it, but we have a question from a participant wondering if you could dig in a little bit on that topic. Who wants to start?
I'm happy to, or I'm happy to defer to Carla and Brad, whatever is easier for my co-panelists. Lynn, I guess.
Yeah, go ahead.
From my experience, this is different than other types of disability because the harm to others is more direct. Yes, there could be harm in any type of medical condition to others, but here there is certainly more of a direct threat in many cases. And so I have discussed with my coworkers on the management side how probably less deference to privacy concerns than the typical disability, but that doesn't mean no deference. And so what I try to do when dealing with the issue, as I alluded to in my remarks, well, who has it? Well, why do you need to know? Let's see if we could protect the employee's privacy while still helping the workforce collectively remain safe. And I recognize there is much more of a collective concern in this situation than there is in the disability situation. So when dealing with unions on this, try to engage in what you folks are well aware of is called accommodative bargaining, where I try to understand what the unions in many cases want from an informational perspective and see if I could provide some kind of alternative that provides their information that they seek for legitimate purposes while still protecting employee privacy.
So I think it's true. The EEOC has issued some questions and answers on how this relates to the ADA and what questions you can ask and you can't ask. And the CDC has declared that COVID is a direct threat, and so then that has different implications. So I think I think what Ken is saying is true, but I think what you have to be very careful about is it's still protected information. And so we need to make sure that when employers learn that an employee either had COVID or was exposed or whatever it is, that information, and even with the temperature screens, that information has to stay in the medical file, not in the personnel file. It still has to be segregated medical information that's kept separately. And it cannot be used against that employee. You can't later discriminate against that employee, whether it's favorably or unfavorably later. So we have to make sure that people are not saying, well, we're going to treat the people who had COVID differently than the other people, and therefore, for example, as one of the prior people said, avoid seniority. Like the people who had COVID will get to pick these shifts, whereas the people who didn't have COVID don't get to pick those shifts. We still have to adhere to our seniority provisions and make sure that we're not violating those provisions in any way. So while it is important to have this information, and I think there are ways to share with the workforce, for example, you don't have to say, you know, Jane Doe was diagnosed with COVID, but you can say, yes, we have had an employee who's been diagnosed with COVID, and we're doing a deep clean, you know, in that work area or for that shift, or these employees, you know, if an employee's been exposed, they need to know that, right? That's part of the CDC thing. So there's ways to do that. I think it is important to remember, though, that while there is attention, and there is more flexibility than other types of disabilities, this is still medical information, and it still needs to be kept in the separately, and we still can't use it to discriminate against people, no matter what that means.
Thank you. Brad, did you want to add anything in on this?
Well, I'll simply add that even in the non-union context, whether it's HIPAA or a general concern for employees' well-being, employers are finding ways to accommodate, providing information that someone has tested positive, assurances that they continue to do a deep clean, assurances that they will go ahead and protect and check the rest of the workforce on a regular basis to try to allay any concerns. But it's a rock and a hard place that employers are going to be stuck between for a long time, I'm afraid.
I want to add one point here, and that is, and Carla alluded to this, the EEOC has recognized that COVID-19 is a direct threat, and that has implications. So if someone tests positive, even if they're asymptomatic, the employer can tell them to leave the workplace and can remove them. And that's different than most other types of disabilities where the employee can perform the job at the time. A positive test means the employer can take action and that to remove the employee from the workplace, and that will not be found to be unlawful discrimination. And that's an important point to keep the workplace safe.
Thank you. That's a really important point to add in. Thank you for adding that. I am seeing that we are just about out of time. I want to say that this session is being recorded, and I don't know if the comments in the chat function are going to the comments from people who have joined us from outside of the United States with an international perspective on some of these issues. So I really hope that people have a chance to check those out. And again, just really want our speakers taking time, and all of you for being here for this session. Can you please join me in giving a virtual round of applause to our three speakers? Yes. Thank you so much. And everybody be safe, please. Take care.
Thank you all. Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
If we could have our speakers stay on the line for just a moment, that would be great. So Lynn, Brad, Kathy.
I think Brad's already gone.
He's already gone.
Oh, no, there he is.
There he is.
They're just shifting.
Can we have permission from you to post a recording of this to attendees and members, to anyone who spoke in the session?
Sure.
So that's
No
a sure
problem.
from Lynn.
That was Carla, but Lynn says
Carla?
yes too. Yeah.
Carla. What about you, Brad?
Brad says fine too.
Okay.
And Ken?
And Ken.
said
Wonderful.
yes. Who else appeared in the video?
I don't think anyone else did. I don't
No
think
one
anyone.
else?
No,
Lynn did-
Lynn did the questions.
You did all the questions yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did. I hope
Great.
nobody raised their hand because I can actually see it.
I didn't see anyone raise their hand.
This is Joel, Lynn. You did a great job of capturing the questions.
Yeah.
I've copied everything from the chat into into a couple slides. I think I got everything, but I'll send that, Lynn, to you and to Bernadette and Emily so that it can be posted along with the video.
Thank you,
Wonderful.
Joel.
Thank you.
Amazing.
So much. And while we're here together, I just,
Everyone on the panel.
Brad and Ken and Carla, thank you. That was so gelled. You really gelled as a pair.
And Lynn, I'm from over here.
I'm from here.
Where
Funny.
are you from? Midland?
Midland. You?
Uh, town just north of Detroit, but I've got a place in Petoskey now. So I'm hoping that Governor Whitmer will eventually allow me to get there.
I think she'll let you take your private boat over there now. So
Yeah, there you go.
great. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Carla.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
Bye.
Emily, I have a question if it's not too late.
Sure.
I really enjoyed the program. I thought it was very informative. Will LERA be presenting a